So we're going to run through how to use Excel's data analysis tool pack to do a comparison of means or a t-test. And this is one of the simpler, more straightforward tests that you can run using Excel's data analysis tool pack. And I'll walk you through it really quickly. Again, for this example, I'll be using data that I compiled based on an article from Sandholz and Kotzel dealing with corruption data from Transparency International. And so this is the corruption perception index value from 1996 with higher scores representing lower levels of corruption, lower scores representing higher levels of corruption. And it's scored for 54 countries. And one of the variables that is identified in their analysis as possibly explaining levels of corruption for countries is whether a country is a former British colony. And this is something that I think there are certainly different political and economic discrepancies between how the British administered colonies versus areas that were not colonized, or maybe French administered colonies. But again, the effect that that has on corruption today is an empirical question, and I think it's something that we can actually test. So to do that, we're going to look at two different groups, former British colonies, which are coded 1 in our data set here, like Australia, and not former British colonies, which are coded 0, such as Argentina. And we're going to see if they have different levels of corruption across those two groups. Now, in order to do that, we need to restructure and reorganize our data. And so I'm going to create a new worksheet, and I'm going to label it t-test data, just to kind of keep myself mentally clear on which tab is which. And I'm going to go up to the data and choose the filter option, because that allows for me to click on this little drop-down arrow and choose to look at only non-British colonies, so the 0 category. And so when I click there, it hides from me all of the ones in that column. All right, so it goes 1, 2, jumps to 4, 6, and so on. And so it's hidden away all of the former British colonies. And so when I pick up all the data in this column for my corruption perception index score from 1996, you can see that it's highlighting very different sets of blocks of data. And I can bring it over here to my t-test data worksheet and paste it in. And it brings over the 38 or so cases that are not former British colonies. And so I just need to relabel this as not former British colony. And I'll increase that a little bit. And then I come back to my original data, and I'll choose to get rid of the not former British colonies and click the 1 for the former British colonies. And it gives me a smaller set of cases, and I can again pick those up, copy them, and bring them over to my new worksheet for now analyzing t-test data. I'll label that as former British colonies. Okay, so now I have 2 columns of data, each column representing a different value of countries in terms of their former colonial status and how that relates to corruption. For the statistical analysis, I'm going to go to my data tab and go over and choose the data analysis tool. I realize the way that Zoom operates, you can't see where that's at, but it's the last item in the toolbar. If you're looking at your data analysis or your data tab and you're not seeing the data analysis tool, it probably means that you need to go to File and Options and down to Add-ins and click on that data analysis tool pack, and then click here where it says Manage Excel Add-ins and click Go. And just make sure that Analysis Tool Pack is checked, and then you should be set. And then it should pop up here on this data tab, and then you can click it and you'll get this box that looks sort of like this, which has a whole bunch of different statistical techniques that you could try to use. The one that we'll be using is the t-test 2-sample assuming unequal variance. We could also run it with the assumed equal variance. I prefer not to make that assumption. It's a little more rigorous of a test. And so I'll stick with the t-test 2-sample assuming unequal variance. Okay, and so I get a box, and it's going to ask me a couple questions. It's going to ask me, are there labels at the top of your data? The answer is yes, there are. It's going to ask me for your first variable, what's the range that you're looking at? And so I can just click on that little sort of data thing and select the cases I'm interested in. And I can do it again for variable 2. I can click on there and I can say these are where my second set of values are at. And if I wanted to declare a hypothesized mean difference, I could. Typically, our hypothesis test is that there's no difference between groups or 0. If you don't put anything in there, Excel will just assume that you mean 0 because that is the standard hypothesis test for a t-test. And then we can figure out where we want to put our data. We could put it into a new worksheet and have it generate a new worksheet, or we could have it dump the analysis into this worksheet. And so I'm going to say, put the analysis into E1 and move out from there. So I'm going to click on that. And I think I've declared everything I need for this to be able to run successfully. And so I'm going to click OK. And sure enough, some data pops up, some analysis pops up. I'm going to maybe make that a little bit easier to read by spreading things out a little bit. And so we've got 2 columns here that have the 2 labels from our data columns. And there's some descriptive statistics for each of those columns. And so I can know what the mean is for former British colonies. And for not former British colonies, and just eyeballing it, it looks like the mean value is slightly higher for former British colonies, but maybe not hugely different. I can look at the variance between those two, and I can see that there's 38 not former British colonies in my data and 16 former British colonies. Degrees of freedom, hypothesized mean, those are just generated from the size of your sample and what we declared earlier. And then our t statistic, so -0.4, which is not a particularly large t statistic, suggesting that that difference that we see here between these two means is not a large difference considering the level of sampling variation that we see for samples of this size for a sample of 22 degrees of freedom. And then not surprisingly, when we look at our p-value, a p-value of 0.33 suggests that we cannot reject the null hypothesis of no difference. And we're left to conclude that, yeah, there probably is no difference between these two groups, that former British colonies and not former British colonies have comparable levels of corruption. So fairly straightforward to do, but it's useful to sort of think through how to organize the data, how to extract it from a larger data set into something that Excel can handle for analysis.